She walked into that building with unpaid bills in her purse and pride as her only armor. They laughed at her poverty, mocked her shoes, questioned if she belonged in that room at all. What none of them knew, what she herself didn't know, was that behind the glass wall someone was watching. Someone powerful. Someone who saw not a poor girl begging for a job, but a woman who refused to break. And that moment would change everything. Guys, before I continue, I need to ask for your help. This channel doesn't generate any revenue for me anymore. I don't make any money from these videos, but I have an incredible team that works every week to bring you quality content, and I want to keep that going. That's why I created Allure TV, an app with narrated stories, uncensored, unedited, and ad-free. Things that this platform would never allow here. There's new content every day of the week, and you can listen to it in multiple languages or read it if you prefer. The link is pinned in the comments, or just point your camera at the QR code that's on the screen right now. Help us keep the channel active. I'm truly grateful. Help us keep the channel active. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and Anne stepped into the glass-walled lobby of Whitlock Enterprises, her heels echoing against marble that gleamed like something out of a magazine she'd never afford. She smoothed the front of her blazer, tailored herself late into the night with a needle borrowed from her neighbor, and told herself this was just a building, just a job, just another chance to breathe a little easier. Her phone buzzed in her bag. A text from the landlord. Second notice. She silenced it without looking twice and walked toward the reception desk, chin lifted, spine straight, the way her mother taught her before she passed. Never let them see you shrink. Anne Foster, 10 a.m. interview, she said, and the receptionist, barely glancing up, gestured toward a row of chairs near a wall of frosted glass. She sat, waited, watched executives glide past in shoes that cost more than her monthly rent, their laughter easy, careless, the sound of people who had never had to calculate whether groceries or electricity came first. Anne folded her hands in her lap and focused on her breathing, counting the seconds, steadying the tremor in her fingers. Miss Foster. A woman in a sharp charcoal suit appeared in the doorway, Vanessa, according to the badge clipped to her lapel, her smile polished but cold, like glass under fluorescent light. This way. The office was smaller than Anne expected, all clean lines and expensive minimalism. A single black desk, 2 chairs, a wall of windows overlooking the city's steel skyline. Vanessa sat first, crossing her legs, letting the silence stretch just a beat too long before speaking. So, she flipped through Anne's resume without really reading it. Tell me why you want this position. I'm hard-working, Anne said, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. I learn quickly, and I take responsibility seriously. This role would mean a lot to me. Vanessa's eyes flicked up, sweeping over Anne's blazer, her shoes, the faint fray at the cuff she'd tried to hide. And where did you go to school? Riverside Community College. I transferred credits toward a business degree, but I had to pause my studies to work full-time. I see. A pause, deliberate, cruel in its patience. This role requires a certain image, client-facing, polished. Her gaze lingered pointedly on Anne's shoes. Do you think you can maintain that, given your circumstances? The words landed like a slap dressed up as a question. Anne felt heat rise in her face, but she didn't look away. I think professionalism isn't about what someone wears. It's about how they treat people and how they do their job. Vanessa's smile thinned. Cute answer, but we both know appearances matter in this industry. I just want to make sure you understand what you'd be walking into. It would be embarrassing for everyone if you weren't prepared for that. Something in Anne's chest went very still. Not the sting of humiliation exactly, but something colder, sharper, recognition. She had seen this before, this particular brand of cruelty dressed in expensive fabric, and she refused to let it move her. I understand exactly what I'd be walking into, Anne said quietly, and I think we're done here. She stood before Vanessa could respond, gathered her bag, and walked out with her shoulders squared, refusing to let the tears burning behind her eyes fall in front of a woman who didn't deserve to see them. The door clicked shut behind her, and for one moment in the hallway she let herself exhale, long, shaking, silent. That was when she heard it. A muffled sound from around the corner, someone crying softly near the supply closet. Anne hesitated, then followed the sound instead of the exit sign. A young woman in a company polo sat on an overturned crate, phone in her lap, face buried in her hands. Papers were scattered at her feet, printouts, spreadsheets, something that looked like a termination notice. "Hey." Anne crouched beside her, voice gentle. "Are you okay?" The woman looked up, startled, mascara smudged beneath red-rimmed eyes. "I'm fine, sorry. You don't need to—" "I've got a minute," Anne said, and meant it, even though every rational part of her screamed that she had rent to worry about, a bus to catch, a life falling apart at the seams. She knelt anyway and began gathering the scattered papers, stacking them neatly, buying the woman a moment to breathe. "They're cutting my department," the woman said finally, voice cracking. 15 years here, and they didn't even tell me in person." "That's awful," Anne said simply. "No platitudes, no false comfort, just presence." "You don't deserve that." The woman managed a small, watery laugh. "You don't even know me." "Doesn't matter. Nobody deserves to find out something like that alone in a hallway." Anne handed her the stack of papers, her hand brushing the woman's for a brief moment, warm and steady. "Is there someone you can call? Someone who can come sit with you?" "My sister. She's close by." The woman wiped her eyes, composing herself. "Thank you. Really. Most people just walk past." "I know," Anne said, and something flickered behind her eyes. Memory, maybe, of all the times she'd wished someone had simply stopped. She helped the woman to her feet, watched her disappear toward the elevators with her phone already pressed to her ear, and only then did Anne allow herself to check the time. She'd missed her bus. She had, quite possibly, just walked out of the only job offer she'd gotten in 3 months, and yet, strangely, she didn't regret it. What Anne didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that behind the reflective glass of the observation room 2 floors up, a man in a charcoal suit had watched the entire exchange in silence. The interview, the walkout, the quiet kindness in the hallway that no one had asked her to give. He hadn't moved from the window in almost 10 minutes, and whatever he was feeling, watching her disappear into the elevator, it was not something he had a name for yet. Simon Whitlock stood motionless behind the one-way glass, one hand resting against the cool surface, the other loosely curled at his side. Below, in the small office where interviews were conducted, Vanessa was already gathering her folders, oblivious to the fact that she was being watched, or perhaps simply indifferent to it. After all, she had no reason to think this interview mattered more than any other. But it did. Simon had felt it the moment the young woman walked in. He hadn't meant to watch this particular interview. He'd stopped by the observation room out of habit, the way he often did between meetings, glancing over candidates the way he might glance over spreadsheets, efficient, detached, uninvolved. But something about the way she carried herself had stopped him cold. Not the blazer, clearly altered by hand, not the shoes worn thin at the heel. It was the way she sat, spine straight, chin level, hands folded with a stillness that didn't look like calm so much as controlled restraint. He had watched people crumble in that chair before, watched them shrink under Vanessa's particular brand of condescension, watched them stammer and over-explain and apologize for things that needed no apology. This woman had done none of that. I understand exactly what I'd be walking into, and I think we're done here. Simon exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible in the quiet room. He'd heard hundreds of resignations, hundreds of people quitting jobs they'd only just started, but never one delivered with that particular blend of dignity and steel. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't cried. She had simply refused to be diminished, and then she had walked out like the humiliation belonged to someone else entirely. He watched her disappear from the office, expecting that to be the end of it, a name on a rejected application, a footnote in someone else's morning. Instead, the hallway camera feed on the adjacent monitor caught her again, kneeling beside a crying employee outside the supply closet, gathering scattered papers with the same steady hands that had, minutes earlier, refused to shake in front of Vanessa. Simon leaned forward slightly, arms crossing over his chest, something unfamiliar tightening behind his ribs. She didn't know she was being filmed. She didn't know anyone of consequence was watching. And still, she knelt on that floor and gave a stranger her full attention, her voice gentle in a way that felt entirely unrehearsed, nothing like the performative warmth he'd grown so used to from people who wanted something from him. Nobody deserves to find out something like that alone in a hallway. The words settled into him with unexpected weight. He thought of his own hallways, glass and marble, cold even in summer, and the years he'd spent learning that kindness, freely given, was usually a transaction in disguise. He'd built an empire on that assumption. It had never once failed him, until now, watching a woman with unpaid bills folded somewhere behind her eyes choose compassion over convenience, for no reason at all. The door behind him opened. "Sir?" His assistant, Marcus, poked his head in. "Vanessa's ready to submit her interview notes. Should I—" "Hold them," Simon said, not turning around. Marcus blinked. "Sir? I want to see the full file. Every candidate interviewed today. Resumes, notes, everything." Simon's voice was even, controlled, but there was an edge beneath it that Marcus had learned over 3 years of employment not to question. "Of course. Any particular reason?" Simon finally turned from the glass, his expression unreadable, the same expression that had over the years made grown executives sweat through their suits in boardrooms. "Because I just watched my head of HR humiliate a candidate for being poor, and I want to know how many times that's happened before today." Marcus's face shifted, understanding dawning slowly. "I'll pull the files immediately." "And Marcus," Simon added before the younger man could leave, "the candidate who just walked out, Anne Foster, I want her application reviewed again. Properly this time." "Reviewed how exactly?" "Blind review. No photo, no address, no personal details that don't relate to qualifications. I want her assessed on merit alone, the way every candidate should have been assessed from the start." Marcus hesitated. "And if she still doesn't meet the requirements, then she doesn't get the job." Simon's tone left no room for argument. "But if she's qualified, and I suspect she is, she gets a fair shot, one she should have had the first time." Marcus nodded, already reaching for his tablet, fingers moving quickly across the screen. "I'll have the revised file ready by end of day. Should I loop in legal, given the nature of the complaint?" "Not a complaint," Simon said, turning back toward the glass, though the office below now sat empty, the chair where she'd sat still slightly askew. "An internal correction. Vanessa doesn't need to know why." "And Miss Foster? Should she be informed of the change in process?" Simon was quiet for a long moment, his reflection faint and ghost-like against the darkened glass. "No," he said finally. "She's not to know I had anything to do with this. Not now, not ever, unless I decide otherwise. That's a specific request, sir. It's the only request." Simon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "If she finds out, she'll think this was pity, charity, and it wasn't." He paused, searching for the right words, surprised at how difficult they were to locate. "She earned a fair evaluation. That's all this is." Marcus studied him for a beat longer than necessary, something knowing flickering behind his eyes, before he wisely said nothing about it. "Understood. I'll have everything processed quietly." He left, and Simon remained by the window, alone with the hum of the building around him. Elevators rising and falling, phones ringing somewhere down the hall, the ordinary rhythm of an empire that had never once made him feel the way this stranger had in under 15 minutes. He thought of her voice again, calm and unwavering. "I think we're done here." He thought, too, of the way she'd knelt on that hallway floor, asking nothing in return. Simon Whitlock had built his entire life on control, on knowing outcomes before they happened, on eliminating risk before it could touch him. But standing there, staring at an empty chair in an empty room, he had the distinct and unfamiliar sensation of having just lost control of something entirely. He didn't yet know her favorite color, her laugh, the sound of her voice raised in anger or joy. He knew nothing about her, really. Nothing except the fact that she had walked away from a job she needed, rather than sacrifice who she was. And somehow, that single fact had already told him everything. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, while Anne was scrubbing dishes in the cramped kitchenette of her apartment, phone wedged between her shoulder and ear as she half listened to the automated hold music of her electric company. When the unknown number flashed on her screen, she almost didn't answer, but something made her set down the sponge and pick up. "Ms. Foster, this is Human Resources at Whitlock Enterprises, calling to follow up on your recent interview." Anne's hands went still, water dripping from her fingers onto the floor. "I'm sorry, I think there might be some confusion. I withdrew from that process." "There was an administrative error in how your interview was documented," the woman on the line said smoothly, professionally, the kind of voice trained to give nothing away. "After review, we'd like to extend an offer for the Client Relations Coordinator position. Would you be available to come in Thursday to finalize paperwork?" For a long moment, Anne said nothing at all. She thought of Vanessa's cold smile, the pointed glance at her shoes, the word circumstances wrapped in false concern. She thought about walking out with her spine straight and her pride intact, certain she'd just closed the door on the only real opportunity she'd had in months. "There's been a correction," she repeated slowly, testing the words. "Yes, ma'am. We apologize for any confusion during your initial interview. We'd love to have you join the team." Anne exhaled, something unclenching in her chest for the first time in weeks. "Thursday works, thank you." She hung up and stood in her kitchen for a long moment, phone still in hand. Disbelief and relief tangled together so tightly she couldn't separate one from the other. An administrative error. She turned the phrase over in her mind, searching for logic in it, and found none. But she didn't have the luxury of questioning good fortune too closely. Not when her landlord's patients had a deadline, and this job came with a salary that could finally close the gap between barely surviving and actually living. Thursday arrived grey and windless, the city humming with its usual restless energy. Anne dressed carefully, the same altered blazer freshly pressed, her only interview pumps polished as best she could manage. She arrived 20 minutes early, sat in the same lobby, and watched the same executives glide past, though this time her chair felt different beneath her. Not because anything around her had changed, but because something inside her had. "Ms. Foster." A different voice this time. Marcus, according to his badge, warm and efficient. "Right this way. Mr. Whitlock would like to meet you personally before you sign anything." Anne blinked. "Mr. Whitlock, the owner." "CEO," Marcus corrected gently, a small smile tugging at his mouth. "He likes to meet new hires for client-facing roles. Don't worry, it's brief." She followed him down a hallway she didn't recognize, the executive floor, all glass and quiet, and the particular hush of significant money, until they reached a door at the end of the corridor. Marcus knocked once, then opened it, gesturing her inside before disappearing himself. The office was larger than Vanessa's, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the entire skyline, and behind a desk of dark, polished wood stood a man who turned as she entered. Anne's breath caught, though she couldn't have explained why. He was tall, dressed in charcoal that fit him with the precision of tailoring, far beyond her old blazer's reach, dark hair slightly disheveled as though he'd run a hand through it recently. But it wasn't his appearance that stopped her. It was his eyes, sharp and assessing, fixed on her with an intensity that made the room feel smaller than it was. "Ms. Foster." His voice was low, controlled, though something flickered beneath it she couldn't quite name. "Simon Whitlock, thank you for coming back." "Thank you for the opportunity," Anne said carefully, extending her hand. His grip was firm, brief, warmer than she expected. "Though I have to admit, I'm still a little confused about the administrative error." Something shifted behind his eyes, gone almost before she could be certain she'd seen it. Human error happens more than it should in hiring. We take those mistakes seriously when they're brought to our attention. "That's good to hear." She studied him, unable to shake the feeling that there was more beneath his measured tone than he was letting on. Most companies wouldn't bother correcting it. Most companies don't like admitting fault. A faint, almost imperceptible smile crossed his mouth. "I'm not most companies." Anne felt something warm unfurl low in her stomach, unexpected and slightly unsettling. She pushed the sensation aside, reminding herself this was her employer, not someone she had any business noticing the way she was noticing him. The low timbre of his voice, the way his gaze held hers without wavering, as though she were the only thing of consequence in the room. "Please sit." He gestured to the chair across from his desk, and Anne obeyed, smoothing her skirt as she lowered herself into it. "I reviewed your file personally. Your previous work experience, your coursework. You're overqualified for this role, if I'm honest." "I needed the job," Anne said simply, without shame. "Overqualified pays the bills just as well as perfectly matched." Something in his expression softened, though his voice remained even. A pragmatic answer. A true one. He studied her for a long moment, long enough that Anne felt heat rise faintly in her cheeks, though she refused to look away first. "I appreciate honesty, Miss Foster. It's rarer than people think in this building." "Then we'll get along fine," she said, a note of dry humor slipping into her voice before she could stop it, "because I don't know how to be anything else." For the first time, Simon laughed, a short, surprised sound, as though it had escaped before he could catch it. "No, I don't suppose you do." He slid a folder across the desk toward her. Contracts, benefits information, the mundane paperwork of a new beginning. But as she reached for it, their fingers brushed briefly against the edge of the folder, and Anne felt the contact like a small current running up her arm, gone as quickly as it came. If Simon felt it too, he gave no sign, his expression carefully composed as he rose from his chair. "Welcome to Whitlock Enterprises, Miss Foster. I trust you'll find the environment fairer this time." "I trust I will," Anne said, standing as well, though something in his phrasing snagged at her thoughts, this time as though he knew precisely what she'd endured the first time around. She left his office moments later, contract in hand, pulse still oddly unsteady, and couldn't shake the feeling that Simon Whitlock knew far more about her rejected interview than any CEO reasonably should. By the end of her second week, Anne had settled into a rhythm, mornings spent fielding client emails, afternoons in meetings she barely understood the acronyms for, evenings spent memorizing the names of people who mattered and the ones who merely thought they did. She was good at the job, better than she'd expected to be, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she allowed herself the small luxury of feeling competent. What she hadn't expected was Simon Whitlock. He appeared with a frequency that seemed, on the surface, entirely reasonable. A CEO checking in on a new hire, ensuring a smooth transition. But Anne had spent her whole life reading rooms, reading people, learning the difference between genuine interest and performance, and Simon's visits, however professionally framed, didn't feel like performance. "Miss Foster." He appeared in the doorway of the small conference room where she was reviewing client files, his tie loosened slightly, sleeves rolled to the forearm in a way that suggested a long day rather than careless dress. "I need your input on the Hartley account. Do you have a moment?" Anne glanced at the stack of unrelated paperwork in front of her, then back at him. "The Hartley account isn't mine." "No," he agreed, stepping further into the room. "But you have a good instinct for client communication, and I'd value a fresh perspective. You have an entire floor of people whose actual job is client communication." "I'm aware." A faint, almost sheepish smile crossed his face, an expression she hadn't yet seen on him, and one that did something strange and warm to her chest. "Humor me anyway." She should have said no. She had actual work to finish, deadlines that didn't care whose attention she'd caught. But there was something in the way he asked, not as her employer issuing a directive, but almost as though he genuinely wanted her opinion, that made refusal feel unnecessarily harsh. "Fine, 5 minutes." The 5 minutes became 20. Simon perched on the edge of the conference table rather than taking a seat, listening with a focus that made Anne acutely aware of every word she chose. When she finished, he nodded slowly, jotting something on his tablet. "That's exactly the angle we were missing," he said. "Thank you." "You could have asked literally anyone else in this building." "I could have," he agreed, and there was something almost playful in his tone now, something at odds with the controlled, distant man she'd met her first day. "I asked you." Anne narrowed her eyes slightly, studying him. "Mr. Whitlock, is there a reason you keep finding excuses to talk to me?" The question landed heavier than she intended, and for a moment, something flickered across his face, caught almost, though he recovered quickly. I like to stay involved with new hires, especially ones who make an impression. I made an impression by walking out of an interview. You made an impression, he said, voice quieter now, by refusing to let someone convince you that you were less than you are. Anne's breath caught. She hadn't told him about Vanessa's comments, not directly, not in detail. The specificity of his words settled uneasily in her stomach, a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit the picture he'd painted of himself. How do you know what happened in that interview? Something shuttered behind his eyes, quick and deliberate. HR flagged some concerns during the review process. I make it a point to know when something's gone wrong under my roof. It was a reasonable answer, professional even, and yet Anne couldn't shake the sense that he was choosing his words with unusual care, the way people did when they were protecting something rather than explaining it. Well, she said finally, deciding to let it go for now. I appreciate that you take it seriously. I take a lot of things seriously that I probably shouldn't examine too closely, he murmured, almost to himself, before straightening and clearing his throat. The coffee machine on this floor is broken again. I'm headed to the one on 12. Walk with me? It wasn't really a question, but it wasn't quite a demand either. Something in between that left room for her to decline. She didn't. The elevator ride to the 12th floor was quiet, the kind of silence that felt charged rather than empty. Simon's shoulder inches from hers in the confined space, close enough that she caught the faint scent of his cologne. Clean, understated, something like cedar and rain-washed stone. She found herself cataloguing it before she could stop herself, filing it away in some part of her mind she hadn't given permission to notice such things. You're quiet, he observed, glancing sideways at her. I'm thinking. About how the CEO of a company this size has time to personally escort a coordinator to get coffee. A slow smile spread across his face, unguarded in a way she hadn't seen before. Maybe I don't have time. Maybe I'm making time. Anne felt her pulse stutter, an unwelcome and undeniable warmth spreading through her chest. That's a very deliberate answer, Mr. Whitlock. Simon, he corrected softly. When it's just us, you can call me Simon. The elevator doors opened before she could respond, sparing her from having to examine why the sound of her own name in his voice, paired with the offer of his, made something in her chest tighten pleasantly. They walked to the break room together, and Anne noticed, couldn't help but notice, the way conversations quieted slightly as they passed, the way eyes followed them with poorly disguised curiosity. She ignored it, focusing instead on Simon pouring coffee with unnecessary precision, handing her a cup without asking how she took it. Black, no sugar, he said, before she could ask how he knew. You mentioned it during your first week. I remember things. Apparently. He held her gaze a beat too long, something unspoken passing between them, charged and fragile as static electricity. Then, as if catching himself, he cleared his throat and glanced toward the window. I should let you get back to work. Thank you for the heartly insight. Any time, Anne said, surprised to find she meant it. She watched him walk away, coffee cup steaming faintly in her hand, and thought about the countless small moments accumulating between them. Moments too specific to be coincidence, too careful to be ordinary. She didn't know what it meant yet, only that, whatever it was different from anything she'd expected when she'd walked back into this building. And whatever it was, she suspected, was only just beginning. The office had emptied by 7, the building settling into that particular hush that only came after most of its occupants had gone home, phones silent, printers dormant, the hum of the city outside muted behind glass. Anne stayed later than she meant to, buried in a client presentation that refused to come together, coffee gone cold beside her keyboard. She didn't hear Simon approach until his voice broke the silence. Still here. She startled, glancing up to find him leaning against her doorframe, jacket removed, sleeves rolled up, looking less like the composed CEO she'd grown used to, and more like a man who'd simply run out of reasons to keep working and hadn't yet gone home. Trying to fix a presentation that doesn't want to be fixed, Anne admitted, rubbing her eyes. What's your excuse? Same, more or less, different presentation. He stepped inside, glancing at her screen. Mind if I take a look? She should have said she was fine, that she didn't need help. that spending more unsupervised time with her employer was probably unwise given the strange current that seemed to run between them lately. Instead, she turned her laptop toward him. "Be my guest." He pulled a chair beside hers, close enough that she caught that same clean, understated scent she'd noticed in the elevator days before. For several minutes they worked in comfortable silence, Simon pointing out awkward phrasing, Anne rewriting sentences, until they found the meeting point between his precision and her strategy. "There," he said finally, leaning back. "Better." "Much better," Anne agreed, saving the file. "Thank you." Neither of them moved to leave. "Do you want to get out of here?" Simon asked suddenly, and something in his tone, hesitant, almost boyish, caught her off guard. "Not for work, just somewhere that isn't this building." Anne studied him, weighing the offer against every instinct that told her this was complicated territory. But the truth was, she was tired of complicated territory, being the reason she said no to things. "Where did you have in mind?" "The rooftop terrace, 20th floor. Hardly anyone uses it after hours." The terrace was quiet. The city sprawled beneath them in a constellation of lit windows and distant traffic, the air cool, but not unpleasant against her skin. Anne wrapped her arms loosely around herself, taking in the view, while Simon retrieved 2 bottles of water from a small refrigerator tucked near the entrance. "This is beautiful," she said, meaning it. "It's one of the only places in this building where I actually think clearly." He handed her a bottle, settling beside her at the railing, close but not touching. "Everywhere else there's noise, decisions, people wanting things from me. And here it's just quiet." He was silent for a moment, gazing out at the skyline. "My father built this company from nothing, taught me that everything and every relationship, every deal, comes down to leverage. What you can offer, what you can take." "That sounds exhausting." It was. Something flickered across his face, old and unguarded. He wasn't a warm man. Love in our house always came with conditions. Good grades earned approval. Good behavior earned attention. I don't think I understood affection without strings until I was well into adulthood, and even then I'm not sure I fully believe in it. Anne turned to look at him fully, struck by the honesty in his voice. No performance in it, no calculation. That's a lonely way to grow up. "It was efficient," he said, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "I built an empire on it. I just never learned how to build anything else." "You're building something else now," Anne said quietly, "whether you meant to or not." Simon turned to face her fully, something raw and unguarded in his expression. "What do you mean?" "You didn't have to come find me tonight. You didn't have to fix a broken coffee machine excuse into a walk to the 12th floor, or ask a coordinator's opinion on an account that isn't hers." She held his gaze, steady despite the sudden thrum of her own heartbeat. "You're trying, Simon, whether or not you'd admit it." He was quiet for a long moment, the city humming faintly below them. "You make it difficult to keep pretending I have this all figured out." "Good," Anne said softly. "Nobody should have it all figured out. It's exhausting to watch, if nothing else." A short laugh escaped him, surprised and genuine. "You're very direct." "I've had to be. Life doesn't leave much room for subtlety when you're worried about rent." Something shifted in his expression. Not pity, she noted with relief, but something closer to respect. "Tell me about that, if you're willing." So she did. She told him about her mother's illness, the medical bills that outlasted her mother's life, the years spent working 2 jobs while finishing what credits she could afford. She told him about learning to mend her own clothes, to stretch a single meal across 2 days, to walk into rooms full of people who had never once had to calculate whether they could afford both electricity and groceries in the same month. Simon listened without interrupting, without the practiced sympathy she'd grown used to deflecting from people who didn't actually want to understand. When she finished, he didn't offer solutions, didn't try to fix what didn't need fixing. "You didn't need saving," he said finally quietly. "You needed a fair chance. There's a difference." Anne felt something in her chest loosen, some old guarded tension she hadn't realized she was still carrying. "Most people don't understand that difference." "I'm starting to. His eyes held hers, dark and steady in the dim terrace light, close enough now that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, despite the cool night air. Anne. Her name in his voice, low and unguarded, sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Simon," she whispered back, unsure if it was a warning or an invitation. Neither of them moved for a long moment, the space between them charged and fragile, his gaze dropping briefly to her mouth before returning to her eyes. Anne's pulse thundered in her ears, every rational thought dissolving beneath the sheer weight of his attention. Then, somewhere below, a door slammed, distant, ordinary, entirely unrelated to them, and the moment fractured, both of them stepping back half a pace, as though remembering, all at once, exactly where they stood. "It's late," Simon said, voice rougher than before. "I should let you get home." "You should," Anne agreed, though neither of them moved right away. They walked back inside together, the elevator ride down silent and charged, his hand hovering near the small of her back, without quite touching as they stepped through the lobby doors. On the street outside, beneath the amber glow of streetlights, Simon hesitated. "Thank you," he said, "for staying tonight, for listening." "Thank you for asking," Anne replied, and meant it more than she expected to. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her one last time. "Anne," she glanced back, "I'm glad you didn't take that first job offer at face value." His expression was unreadable in the dim light, but his voice carried something unmistakably sincere. "I'm glad you came back." She didn't fully understand the weight behind his words, not yet, but she carried them home with her regardless, turning them over long after she'd climbed into bed, sleep eluding her as she replayed the almost moment on the terrace, wondering what might have happened if that door hadn't slammed when it did. The weeks that followed blurred into something Anne hadn't expected to find at Whitlock Enterprises, a rhythm built not around obligation, but around anticipation. She found herself checking the hallway outside her office more often than she'd admit, listening for a particular cadence of footsteps, and hating herself a little each time her pulse quickened before she'd even confirmed it was him. It always was. "You're doing it again," her co-worker Priya murmured one afternoon, sliding a stack of files onto Anne's desk with a knowing look. "Doing what?" "That thing where you pretend you're not watching the door every time someone walks past." Priya raised an eyebrow. "Everyone's noticed, you know, the way Mr. Whitlock finds reasons to be on this floor lately." Anne felt heat rise in her cheeks. "He's the CEO. He's allowed to walk through his own building." "Sure, 6 times a week, personally, to a coordinator's office." Priya's smile was gentle, not unkind. "I'm just saying, just be careful, whatever this is." Anne didn't have an answer for that, mostly because she didn't know what this was herself. She only knew that something had shifted since the rooftop. Some quiet, dangerous permission they'd both granted, without ever naming it. She found him 3 days later in the break room, sleeves rolled up, staring into a coffee mug like it owed him answers. "Rough day?" she asked, reaching for her own cup. "The Hartley deal fell through," he said, not looking up. 3 months of work, gone because their board got cold feet at the last minute." "I'm sorry." She meant it. "You worked hard on that." "We worked hard on that," he corrected, glancing at her now. "Your notes made it into the final pitch, remember? Doesn't feel like much comfort right now." "No," he admitted, "but it's true anyway." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, close enough that Anne could feel the warmth radiating from him, could catch the same clean scent she'd come to recognize without meaning to. His hand reached for the sugar at the same moment hers did, fingers brushing briefly. Not accidental, not quite intentional either, simply inevitable given how often their orbits had begun to overlap. Neither of them pulled away immediately. "Simon," Anne said quietly, testing the weight of using his first name in a public space, "people are starting to talk. About us. Whatever this is." She gestured vaguely between them. "I don't want to be the reason there's gossip in the break room." Something flickered across his face. Not surprise, more like he'd been waiting for her to say it first. "Does it bother you? The talk?" "It bothers me that I don't know how to answer them," she admitted. "I don't know what this is either." He set his mug down, turning to face her fully, the air between them suddenly thick with unspoken things. "I know what I'd like it to be." Anne's breath caught. "Simon, you're my employee," he said, before she could finish, voice low, almost pained. "I know exactly how complicated that makes things. I've thought about it more than I probably should, but every time I try to keep my distance, I find another excuse to be near you instead." "Why?" The question came out softer than she intended, more vulnerable. "Because you're the only person in my life who's never once treated me like I'm a solution to a problem," he said simply. "Everyone else wants something from me, a deal, a favor, an opportunity. You've never asked me for anything." "Maybe I just haven't gotten around to it yet," Anne said, a faint, teasing smile tugging at her mouth, an attempt to lighten the sudden weight of the moment. Simon laughed softly, some of the tension easing from his shoulders. "Somehow I doubt that." They stood there a beat too long, the distance between them shrinking without either of them quite deciding to close it. Anne could see the fine details of his face this close, the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw, the intensity in his dark eyes, the way his gaze kept dropping briefly to her mouth before returning, as though he were fighting some quiet, internal battle. "I should go," Anne murmured, though she made no move to leave. "You should," Simon agreed, equally motionless. The break-room door swung open behind them, and they both startled apart, Priya breezing in with an armful of files, oblivious, or perhaps deliberately pretending to be, to the charged silence she'd just interrupted. "Sorry, didn't mean to intrude," Priya said, though the knowing look she shot Anne suggested otherwise. "You didn't," Simon said smoothly, already retreating toward professional composure, though Anne noticed the faint color still lingering high on his cheekbones. "I was just leaving." He left without another glance, and Anne exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, heart still pounding against her ribs. "Uh-huh," Priya said, arching an eyebrow. "Just leaving. Sure." That evening, Anne stayed late again, not entirely by accident, she'd admit later, though she told herself it was only to finish quarterly reports. She wasn't surprised when Simon appeared in her doorway sometime after 8, tie loosened, expression unreadable. "You're still here," he said. "So are you." "Touché." He stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him, an action that felt significant in a way neither of them acknowledged aloud. "I wanted to apologize for earlier. I shouldn't have said what I did in the break room. It wasn't appropriate, given that you're my boss," Anne finished, standing from her desk. "Yes." "You didn't say anything untrue," she said quietly, closing the distance between them by half a step. "That's what makes it complicated." Simon's jaw tightened, something raw flickering behind his controlled expression. "Anne, if I do something I shouldn't—" "Then we'll figure it out," she interrupted softly, surprising herself with her own certainty. "Together." His gaze dropped to her mouth again, longer this time, and Anne felt her pulse roar in her ears as he took a slow step closer. Close enough now that she could feel his breath ghosting warm against her cheek, close enough that the entire office seemed to hold its breath around them. "Anne," he murmured, voice rough, one hand rising to gently tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, fingers lingering against her jaw. "I don't know how to do this halfway." "Then don't," she whispered back, eyes fluttering closed as he leaned in. Her phone buzzed violently against the desk, shattering the moment with the mundane insistence of an incoming call. Simon froze, inches from her mouth, both of them breathing unevenly in the sudden, jarring silence. "You should get that," he said finally, voice strained, stepping back with visible effort. Anne glanced at the screen, her landlord, a reminder about rent, and felt reality crash back over her all at once, cold and unwelcome. "I should," she agreed, though neither of them moved for a long moment, the almost kiss still hanging thick and unresolved in the air between them. Simon left first, murmuring a quiet goodnight, his composure visibly fractured in a way she'd never seen before. Anne sank back into her chair once the door clicked shut, pressing trembling fingers to her lips, wondering how much longer either of them could keep pretending that whatever this was could be contained by professionalism alone. The company's annual gala was the kind of event Anne had only ever seen in magazines. String quartets, catering trays gleaming under warm light, a ballroom full of people whose watches cost more than her yearly salary. She'd borrowed a dress from Priya, altered the hem herself the night before, and told herself this was simply another work event, nothing more, despite the way her stomach had fluttered all afternoon at the thought of seeing Simon outside the confines of the office. He found her within the first 20 minutes, looking effortlessly composed in a black suit, his eyes finding hers across the room with an intensity that made her breath catch even from a distance. "You look beautiful," he said quietly, once he'd made his way to her side, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it. "You clean up well yourself," Anne replied, a teasing smile tugging at her mouth, though the warmth spreading through her chest was anything but casual. They hadn't spoken directly about the almost kiss in her office, not in the 2 weeks since it happened, though the tension between them had only grown heavier with every stolen glance, every excuse to stand near one another during meetings. Tonight, surrounded by people, it felt both easier and harder to pretend that nothing had shifted. "Can I get you a drink?" Simon asked. "Please." He disappeared toward the bar, and Anne found herself drifting toward the edge of the room, taking in the glittering chandelier overhead, the low hum of conversation and laughter surrounding her. She didn't notice Vanessa approaching until the woman was already beside her, champagne glass in hand, smile sharp as broken glass. "Anne, right?" Vanessa's eyes swept over her borrowed dress with poorly disguised amusement. "I almost didn't recognize you without the interview attire." Anne kept her expression neutral, refusing to give the woman the reaction she was clearly fishing for. "Vanessa, nice to see you." "Is it?" Vanessa's smile widened, something knowing and cruel flickering behind it. "You know, I have to admit, I was surprised when HR overturned my assessment. Very surprised." She took a slow sip of champagne, watching Anne over the rim of her glass. "Until I found out Mr. Whitlock personally requested the review. Watched the whole interview from observation, apparently. Quite invested in your case for someone who'd never met you." The words landed like ice water down Anne's spine. "What are you talking about?" "Oh, you didn't know?" Vanessa's expression shifted into something almost gleeful, delighted by the crack she'd just found in Anne's composure. "He saw everything. The interview, you walking out, all of it. Ordered the whole process redone specifically for you. Blind review, no photos, the works." She leaned in slightly, voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Must be nice, having the boss personally intervene on your behalf. Makes you wonder what you did to earn that kind of attention." Anne felt the floor tilt beneath her, the ballroom's warmth suddenly suffocating instead of comfortable. "You're lying." "Am I?" Vanessa's smile turned pitying, somehow worse than her earlier cruelty. "Ask him yourself, sweetheart. See what he says." She walked away, leaving Anne standing frozen amid the swirl of laughter and clinking glasses, her mind racing back through every moment of the past month, every coincidental meeting, every excuse to seek her out, every carefully worded reassurance that she'd earned her place. All of it recontextualizing itself into something else entirely. Pity, disguised as opportunity. Guilt, wearing the mask of genuine interest. "Anne?" Simon's voice, returning with 2 glasses of champagne, concern flickering across his face the moment he registered her expression. "What's wrong? Did you watch my interview?" The question came out sharper than she intended, cutting through the ambient noise around them. "The one with Vanessa, did you watch it from observation?" Simon's face changed instantly, the color draining slightly, his jaw tightening in a way that told her everything before he even spoke. "Anne, let me explain." "Did you?" she demanded, voice trembling now, the champagne glasses forgotten in his hands. "Yes," he admitted quietly, setting the glasses down on a nearby table, his eyes never leaving hers. "I saw everything. What Vanessa said to you, how you responded. I ordered the process redone because what happened to you was wrong." Anne felt something crack open inside her chest, raw and painful. "So this whole time, the job, the interview redo, all of it, was pity?" "No," Simon said firmly, stepping closer, though Anne instinctively stepped back. "It was never pity. I saw someone with more integrity in 5 minutes than most people show in a lifetime, and I refused to let that go unrecognized because of a broken system. You could have told me, Anne said, voice cracking despite her effort to hold it steady. Instead, I've spent the last month thinking I earned this, earned you, on my own merit. And the whole time you were just... She stopped, unable to finish the sentence, humiliation and betrayal tangling together until she couldn't separate them. You did earn it, Simon said, desperation creeping into his voice now. The interview was blind, Anne. Your qualifications spoke for themselves. I only ensured you got the fair shot you should have had from the beginning. That's not the point. Her voice shook, tears burning behind her eyes, though she refused to let them fall in the middle of a crowded ballroom. The point is, you knew things about me. Private, humiliating things. And you let me believe this was all coincidence. You let me fall for you without telling me the truth. Simon flinched, the words landing exactly as hard as she'd intended them to. I was afraid, he admitted quietly, that if you knew, you'd see exactly what you're seeing right now. That you'd think everything between us was built on obligation instead of choice. I don't know what to think anymore, Anne whispered, stepping back further, putting distance between them that felt both necessary and unbearable. I need to go. Anne, please, don't, she said, voice breaking on the single word, before turning and walking away through the crowd, leaving him standing frozen amid the glittering chaos of a party that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else's life entirely. She didn't look back to see the devastation written plainly across his face, didn't see him standing motionless long after she disappeared through the ballroom doors, 2 abandoned glasses of champagne going flat on the table beside him. Anne didn't answer his calls for 4 days. She watched her phone buzz against the kitchen counter each time his name appeared on the screen, watched it go still again when she let it ring out, and told herself the silence was a form of self-preservation rather than punishment. She wasn't entirely convinced. Work became a careful choreography of avoidance, arriving early enough to miss him in the lobby, taking the stairs instead of the elevator, redirecting client calls that might otherwise route through his office. Priya noticed, of course, though she had the grace not to press too hard. You don't have to tell me what happened, Priya said one afternoon, setting a cup of tea on Anne's desk without being asked. But you look like someone who needs to talk about it anyway. Anne wrapped her hands around the warm mug, staring at nothing in particular. He orchestrated my hiring, watched my humiliating interview from some observation room, then had it redone specifically for me. I found out from Vanessa at the gala, in front of everyone. Priya winced. That's a rough way to learn something like that. The worst part is I don't even know what I'm angriest about, Anne admitted quietly, that he did it, or that he hid it. Or that I let myself believe everything between us was just us. No history, no hidden strings. Maybe it still is, Priya offered gently. People do complicated things for uncomplicated reasons sometimes. Maybe, Anne said, though she didn't believe it. Not yet. Not while the memory of Vanessa's cruel smile still sat sharp and humiliating in her chest, not while every tender moment with Simon now felt tainted by the possibility that it had all started with pity, dressed up as justice. Simon fared no better. He sat in his office long after everyone else had gone home, staring at his phone, Anne's name sitting unanswered in his call log 4 times over. Marcus found him there on the 5th evening, tie discarded somewhere hours earlier, jacket abandoned over the back of his chair. You look terrible, Marcus said without preamble, setting a folder on the desk that Simon made no move to open. Thank you for the honesty. Someone has to provide it. Marcus lowered himself into the chair across from Simon's desk, studying him with the particular patience of someone who'd worked alongside him, long enough to recognize when something had genuinely gotten under his skin. She's still not answering? No. Simon rubbed a hand across his face, exhaustion evident in every line of his posture. I keep thinking if I just explain it right, she'll understand. But every version I rehearse sounds worse out loud than it did in my head. Have you considered that maybe there isn't a version that sounds good? Marcus said, not unkindly. You hid something significant from her, Simon. Doesn't matter how good your intentions were. She has every right to feel blindsided. Simon's jaw tightened. I was protecting her, from feeling like her success was handed to her instead of earned. Were you protecting her? Marcus asked quietly. Or protecting yourself, from having to explain feelings you clearly didn't know what to do with? The question landed with uncomfortable precision, and Simon said nothing for a long moment, staring out at the darkened skyline beyond his window. Both, probably, he admitted finally. I've never been good at this. Any of it. Every relationship in my life has been transactional, leverage, advantage, calculated risk. Anne is the first person who ever made me want something without immediately calculating the cost of wanting it, and I still managed to ruin it by doing exactly what I always do, controlling the outcome instead of trusting her with the truth. So stop controlling it, Marcus said simply. Let her be angry. Let her have space. And when she's ready, if she's ready, tell her the truth without trying to manage how she reacts to it. Simon exhaled slowly, the weight of the advice settling heavy and uncomfortable in his chest. And if she's never ready? Then you'll have to live with the fact that you did the right thing anyway, even when it cost you something, Marcus said, standing to leave. That's usually how integrity works in my experience. It rarely feels good in the moment. He left Simon alone with that thought. The office quiet except for the distant hum of the city beyond the glass. The empty chair across his desk, a persistent, aching reminder of every conversation he wasn't having. On the 5th day, Anne finally worked up the courage to return one of Marcus's calls. Not Simon's, she noted with some relief, a small mercy that made the conversation easier to bear. Ms. Foster, Marcus said, his tone careful, diplomatic. I wanted to check in. Mr. Whitlock wanted me to let you know there's no pressure regarding your position. Your job is secure regardless of anything personal between you and him. He was very clear about that. Something in Anne's chest loosened slightly at the assurance, though the ache beneath it remained. Thank you for telling me that. He also wanted me to say... Marcus hesitated, choosing his words with obvious care. He's not trying to reach you to defend himself. He just wants the chance to explain when and if you're willing to hear it. No pressure either way. Anne closed her eyes, leaning back against her kitchen counter, the quiet apartment around her suddenly feeling too large, too empty. She thought of Simon's face at the gala, not defensive, not dismissive, just raw and honest in a way she hadn't expected. She thought of the rooftop, his voice cracking open about a childhood built on conditional love. She thought of 100 small moments that had felt at the time entirely genuine. Tell him, she said finally, voice quieter than she intended, that I need more time, but that I heard him. I'll pass that along, Marcus said gently. For what it's worth, Ms. Foster, I've worked for that man for 3 years. I've never seen him like this, not once. Anne didn't respond to that, unsure what to do with the weight of it, but long after she'd hung up the phone, the words lingered anyway, refusing to be dismissed as easily as she wanted them to be. She sat alone in her small apartment that night, the city lights glowing faintly through her window, and allowed herself finally to ask the question she'd been avoiding since the gala. Not whether Simon had lied to her, but whether the truth beneath the lie had been real all along. She didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time in 5 days, she found herself willing to look for one. 2 more days passed before Anne texted him. Just 4 words. Can we talk tonight? His response came within seconds. Anywhere you want. Whenever you're ready. And something about the immediacy of it, the absence of pressure or expectation, softened something in her that had remained tightly guarded since the gala. She chose the rooftop terrace. It felt fitting, somehow, to return to the place where things had first shifted between them, to face this conversation somewhere honest. Simon was already there when she arrived, standing at the same railing, city lights spread beneath them in their familiar constellation. He turned as she approached, and Anne noted the exhaustion etched into his face, the same weariness she recognized in her own reflection over the past week. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly, not moving closer, giving her the space she hadn't realized she needed until he offered it. "I said I needed time. I meant it." Anne crossed her arms loosely, not from coldness but from the instinct to protect something vulnerable inside her chest. "But I also couldn't stop thinking about everything. I need to hear it from you, all of it, No editing, no protecting me from the parts that might hurt. Simon nodded slowly, turning to face the skyline rather than her, as though it might be easier to say the truth to the city than directly to her face. I wasn't in that observation room by accident. I stop by sometimes between meetings to observe interviews. Efficiency, mostly, seeing how candidates handle pressure. He paused. I wasn't watching for you specifically, but the moment you walked in, something about you held my attention in a way no candidate ever had before. What was it? Anne asked, genuinely curious despite herself. The way you sat, he said, glancing at her briefly before returning his gaze to the horizon. Straight spine, steady hands, like you'd already decided nothing in that room could break you. I've watched dozens of people crumble under Vanessa's particular brand of cruelty. You didn't crumble. You just left, with more dignity than I've seen from executives twice your seniority. Anne felt her throat tighten, though she said nothing, letting him continue. And then I watched you stop in that hallway, Simon went on, voice roughening slightly, for a stranger who was falling apart, with nothing to gain from helping her. That's when I knew I needed to fix what had happened in that room. Not because I pitied you. He turned to face her fully now, eyes intense, unwavering. Because I admired you. More than I've admired anyone in longer than I can remember. Why didn't you just tell me that? Anne asked, voice softer now, some of her guarded anger beginning to ebb. Instead of hiding it? Because I was afraid, Simon admitted, the words visibly costing him something. Afraid that if you knew I'd intervened, you'd see everything between us differently. That you'd doubt whether you earned your place here, whether anything real could exist between two people who started this unevenly. I told myself silence was protecting you. But really, I think I was protecting myself from ever having to explain feelings I didn't fully understand myself. Anne studied him for a long moment, the honesty in his voice, the vulnerability so at odds with the controlled man she'd first met weeks ago. I felt like a fool, Simon, standing in that ballroom, realizing everyone probably knew before I did, realizing you'd seen the worst moment of my professional life and never told me. I know, he said quietly. And I'm sorry, not for helping you, because I'd do that again in a heartbeat, but for the way I handled the truth. You deserved honesty from the beginning, not a controlled narrative I thought would spare you pain. Anne exhaled slowly, some of the tension in her shoulders finally releasing. I don't want to be someone's project, Simon. I don't want to wonder, every time something good happens to me, whether it happened because I earned it or because you quietly arranged it behind the scenes. You earned everything, Simon said firmly, stepping closer now, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him despite the cool night air. The interview was blind, Anne. No names, no photos, no addresses, just qualifications. You didn't get this job because of me. You got it because you're brilliant at what you do, and because a broken system almost cost this company someone genuinely exceptional. His voice softened. I didn't fall for the woman I rescued. There was no rescuing involved. I fell for the woman who sat in that chair and refused to let anyone convince her she was less than she is. Something in Anne's chest cracked open, warm and overwhelming, tears she'd been holding back finally threatening to spill. I don't want to be saved, Simon. I want to be chosen. There's a difference. I'm not trying to save you, Simon said, voice thick with emotion, closing the last of the distance between them, his hand rising to gently cup her cheek, thumb brushing away a single tear before it could fall. I don't want to be the man who changed your life. I want to be the man you choose to build a life with, one you're already building yourself, brick by brick, without needing anyone's permission or intervention. His forehead dropped to rest gently against hers, breath mingling in the small space between them. I love you, Anne. Not the version of you I imagined, not the woman I thought I was protecting, just you, exactly as you are. Anne's breath caught, her hands rising to rest against his chest, feeling the unsteady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her palms. Simon, you don't have to answer tonight, he murmured, pulling back just enough to meet her eyes, his own vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. I just needed you to know the truth. All of it. No more hidden pieces. Anne stared up at him, the city lights glittering in his dark eyes, every guarded wall she'd built over the past week trembling under the weight of his honesty. She thought of every stolen glance, every deliberate excuse to be near her, every unguarded confession on this very rooftop weeks ago. "I need to think," she whispered finally, though she made no move to step away from him, her hand still resting against his chest, his own hand still cradling her face with a tenderness that made her chest ache. "But Simon, thank you for finally telling me everything." He nodded, understanding evident in his expression, though something fragile and hopeful lingered there too. "Take whatever time you need. I'll be here." She left the rooftop that night with more questions than answers, but for the first time since the gala, the ache in her chest felt less like betrayal and more like the terrifying, fragile beginning of forgiveness. A week passed before Anne called him. She spent those 7 days doing what she did best, working through the problem methodically, turning it over from every angle, refusing to let emotion alone dictate a decision this important. She spoke with Priya over coffee, sat with her own memories of every genuine moment between them, and slowly, carefully, separated the parts of the story that had frightened her from the parts that had simply been true all along. The job was hers, earned, verified, blind reviewed. That much she now knew without doubt. What remained was a simpler, more frightening question, not whether Simon had wronged her, but whether she was willing to risk her heart on a man who had already shown her, in every unguarded moment, exactly who he was. She thought of her mother in the last months of her illness, holding Anne's hand and telling her that the bravest thing a person could do wasn't surviving hardship. It was allowing themselves to be loved anyway, despite every instinct built by hardship to expect betrayal instead. Anne had spent years building walls out of necessity. She hadn't realized until now how exhausting it had become to maintain them. She texted him on a Thursday evening. "Same place?" His response came instantly. "I'll be there." The rooftop terrace looked different this time. Not because anything about it had changed, but because Anne arrived without the armor she'd carried the last time they'd stood there together. Simon was waiting by the railing, hands in his pockets, tension visible in the set of his shoulders as he watched her approach. "You came," he said quietly, something like disbelief threading through his voice. "I said I would." Anne stopped a few feet away, studying him in the soft glow of the city lights. "I've spent the last week thinking about everything you said, about the difference between being saved and being chosen." "And?" Simon asked, voice careful, as though bracing himself for whatever came next. "And I think," Anne said slowly, "that I've been so afraid of being someone's charity case that I almost missed what was actually standing in front of me. You didn't build my life for me, Simon. You corrected an injustice, and then you spent months treating me like an equal, challenging me, listening to me, never once expecting gratitude in exchange for decency." Something loosened visibly in Simon's posture, hope flickering behind the careful control he'd clearly been maintaining. "And let me finish," she said gently, and he nodded, falling silent. "I built this life with my own hands. Every late night, every sacrifice, every moment I chose dignity over comfort, that was mine. Nobody gave that to me. Nobody can take it away either, not even you." She took a step closer, closing some of the distance between them. "But I don't want to build the rest of it alone anymore. Not if I don't have to." Simon's breath caught audibly, his eyes searching hers as though he couldn't quite trust what he was hearing. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Anne said, closing the remaining distance between them entirely, close enough now to feel the warmth radiating from him, close enough to see the raw hope written openly across his face, "that I choose you. Not because you rescued me and not because you're powerful, or because staying would be easier than walking away. I choose you because every version of yourself you've shown me, flawed, honest, trying, is someone I want in my life. Someone I trust." Simon's hand rose slowly, cupping her face with a tenderness that made her breath catch, thumb tracing gently along her cheekbone. "I've spent my entire life believing love came with conditions," he murmured, voice thick with emotion. "You've spent months proving me wrong without even trying." "Maybe we're both still learning," Anne said softly, leaning into his touch. "Then let's learn together," he whispered, closing the last distance between them. Their lips met softly at first, tentative, as though both of them were still afraid of moving too quickly. But the hesitance dissolved almost instantly beneath the weight of everything they'd both been holding back for weeks. Every stolen glance, every interrupted almost moment, every quiet confession neither of them had been ready to fully claim. Simon's hand slid gently to the small of her back, drawing her closer, while Anne's fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, anchoring herself in a moment she'd stopped believing she deserved. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Simon rested his forehead gently against hers, a genuine, unguarded smile spreading across his face. One Anne suspected very few people had ever been privileged enough to witness. "For the record," he murmured, "I've wanted to do that since the night on this exact terrace weeks ago." "I know," Anne said, laughing softly, the sound light and unburdened in a way it hadn't been in longer than she could remember. The door slamming ruined everything. "I've never been more annoyed at a maintenance worker in my life," Simon said, and Anne laughed again, the sound carrying out over the quiet skyline, warm and real. They stood together at the railing for a long while afterward, her back against his chest, his arms wrapped securely around her, both of them watching the city lights flicker below in comfortable, easy silence. No performance, no calculation, nothing transactional about the space between them at all. "Anne," Simon said eventually, voice quiet against her hair. Thank you. For giving me the chance to earn this properly." Anne turned in his arms to face him, studying the sincerity written plainly across his features, the same intensity that had first caught her attention in his office weeks ago, though softened now by something gentler, steadier. "Thank you for waiting," she said simply, "until I was ready to choose it." He smiled, leaning down to press a soft, lingering kiss to her forehead, and Anne closed her eyes, allowing herself, finally, to simply exist inside a moment she'd built with her own two hands, not rescued, not pitied, but chosen, deliberately and completely by a man who had learned alongside her exactly what it meant to love without conditions. Below them, the city carried on exactly as it always had, indifferent to the quiet transformation happening 20 floors above its streets. But for Anne and Simon, standing together at the edge of everything they'd both once feared, the world had never felt more full of possibility. She learned the hardest truth of all: being saved and being chosen are worlds apart. Anne didn't need rescuing. She needed someone to see her worth. In the end, love found her not through pity, but through recognition. What would you choose? Safety, or the risk of being truly seen? Go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're listening from. I love knowing who's on the other side of the screen with me, and if you want more, if you want to experience it all without ads, without interruptions, and with an intensity we can't show here, check out my app. The link is in the pinned comment. New stories every single day, deeper romances, more intense, and some a lot bolder. It's a whole different level in there. Access it now.